And we are pleased to bring you these weekly programs. The Medical Center Hour actually originated with the sort of at the intersection of law and medicine and ethics. And today's program brings us back to that sort of locus. And also we're very proud to feature three very distinguished speakers, none of whom had to travel far. The farthest traveling came for Richard Bonney from the law school. But we're really very lucky to have such distinguished persons on our own faculty here at UVA. The program for today is called Who Gets Organs for Transplant? Medical, Legal, and Ethical Views Occasioned by the Sarah Murnaghan case. Allocating organs for transplantation is a challenge across the world. The list of eligible transplant candidates grows ever longer every year, while the supply of suitable organs remains frustratingly relatively fixed. With such an unequal supply and demand, not everyone who requires a transplant for end-stage organ disease can or will receive this life-saving or life-improving treatment. Hard choices about candidate and donor suitability and priority thus are common. As a result, also, organ trafficking is brisk, even if illegal, in some other parts of the world. Here at home in the U.S., organ distribution is highly regulated and overseen by UNOS, the United Network for Organ Sharing, a private organization that is under contract with the Department of Health and Human Services. These questions about transplant candidate suitability and priority have been with us for quite a while, but they've resurfaced in the headlines earlier this year when 10-year-old Sarah Murnaghan's parents went to court and to the media to request that their daughter, who was dying of cystic fibrosis, be placed on the eligibility list for a lung transplant. Now, Sarah was 10, and there's an age cutoff of 12. The court's decision, UNOS's follow-up, Sarah actually got a new fictitious birth date in order to qualify to receive adult lungs. And Sarah's two double lung transplant procedures galvanized the transplant community, bioethicists, policymakers, lawyers, and the public alike. Even as efforts continue to increase the organ supply, what should we do about our allocation systems? In this Medical Center Hour, we've asked three experts to give us their medical, legal, and ethical opinions. We're going to hear in order from Ken Brayman, who is a professor of surgery and medicine, the NABI professor of transplantation, chief of transplant surgery here at UVA, in the division of transplant surgery at UVA, and director of transplant services for our health system. Second, we'll hear from James Childress, university professor, John Allen Hollingsworth Professor of Ethics, and he also has appointments in religious studies and the medical school, and he directs the Institute for Practical Ethics and Public Life, which is a co-sponsor of today's program. We'll wrap up with the legal perspective offered by Richard Bonney, the Harrison Foundation Professor of Medicine and Law, Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences, Director of the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy, and a Professor of Public Policy with the Batten School here at UVA. We will have some time for your questions and comments, and we hope for a rich and lively discussion. So take it away.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Marcia for organizing a very interesting program and advance my co-speakers, who are some of the world's experts in the law and the ethics of organ allocation. Let's see here. Great. Well, the topic is who gets organs for transplantation. And a very nice introduction was put forth by Marcia. I think organ transplantation from the 30,000-foot view in 2013 has to be recognized as a very highly successful therapy to treat end-stage organ disease. And some of the themes that you'll hear in the next hour are basically that I'm not going to say that we're victims of our own success, but we're so successful as a therapy that we've created a very significant problem with supply and demand. And if you look at the achievements of medicine in general, but transplantation in particular, it's easily argued that transplantation represents the best of medical therapies and therapeutic advances in the last 50 years. It's gotten to the point where the success is so great that an unsuccessful outcome in the context of organ transplantation is unusual and is even scrutinized. And that's very different than the field 50 years ago. It is also true that organ transplantation is expensive, but it is a dramatically life-saving therapy. So we have a very successful therapy with many people that need transplants, but a problem with having not enough transplants available. This slide gives you an overview of some of these issues related to supply and demand. And the waiting list, which is easily accessible to anybody who's interested, because transplantation is one of the most transparent areas of medical care. You can go on the UNOS website and see the number of people who are waiting, the number of transplants that are done, the success rates, and so forth. And we know that there are more than 120,000 people waiting as of yesterday. In 2012, there were 14,013 donors in the United States. 8,000 of those were deceased donors, and there were more than 5,800 living donors. And the total number of transplants that were performed in 2012 was more than 30,000. And those are pretty impressive numbers. The problem with transplantation in supply and demand is illustrated by the fact that even though we've done more than 30,000 transplants last year across the U.S. and associated territories, the wait list grows. And the wait list grows year after year because the number of people that have diseases that could be ameliorated by transplantation is greater and greater. Now, organ transplantation and the allocation of organs is one of the most highly regulated areas of medicine. And in the hour, you'll learn from myself and my co-speakers that there is a very hierarchical governance structure which oversees transplantation. And the United Network for Organ Sharing, located just down the road in Richmond, is a private organization that contracts with the federal government to oversee transplantation activity in the United States. It's private, it's not for profit, and essentially it's an organization of stakeholders who propose rules, including organ allocation rules, and make sure that they're implemented and followed. And the contract with the federal government is organized through the Department of Health and Human Services, and it's renewed every 2 years, and every renewal period has an increasing number of deliverables which the government requires us to comply with, so that we have a number of scientific registries that oversee results of patient and graft survival. Every time there's an organ donor in the United States, the entire list of people waiting for that organ across all candidates is actually printed out, and there's a code that's placed alongside that person's name as to why they didn't get that transplant. It's not possible to skip over people on the list without them being coded by the transplant center and that being checked on by appropriate regulatory components of UNOS, so that there is a high degree of scrutiny in the allocation of organs. Now, the long-standing issues which are underlying this medical center hour and our discussions are really two interrelated questions. Since we're so successful, we don't have enough organs, how do we increase the supply of organs, and how do we distribute organs fairly? And historically, it's very important to note that the National Organ Transplant Act was passed in 1984. Senator Gore was instrumental in organizing this activity, and Jim Childress was highly involved in the development and the discussion of this legislation. And the task force on organ transplantation basically helped to draft the laws which were then implemented in 1987. And it's been mandatory for individual transplant programs, transplant centers, organ procurement organizations to be reporting to UNOS and subsequently the federal government on their activities. And we'll talk about some of the other aspects of this system, which was devised in the 1980s. Now, prior to 1984, before the National Organ Transplant Act and the establishment of the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, the disposition of organs and the authority was pretty much vested in the individual transplant centers. And as you know, when disparities are identified on a national level, oftentimes the federal government will help and step in to try to even the playing field. And that's essentially what happened in the 1980s when there were pockets of really very highly successful organ transplant activity in the United States. Other areas were underperformers, and then legislation was drafted and passed to try to level out the playing field. But essentially, with the establishment of the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, we moved more from a voluntary sharing system to a formal allocation system. And you'll learn a little bit more about that this afternoon. The recommendations of the task force from a philosophical perspective are pretty much the same today as they were in the 1980s, and that is that donated organs are really a public or a national resource. And the organs are allocated with that in mind. And the professionals who participate with the Organ Procurement Transplant Network, the people at UNOS, the voluntary participation on the UNOS committees, which many transplant surgeons, clergy, transplant physicians participate in, is such that the professionals are really trustees or stewards of these donated organs, and the public has entrusted us to make sure that we do this legally, ethically, and with the patient's best interest in mind. Now, the implications, of course, of this are clear. That is that donated organs really belong to the public. They don't belong to me. Now, there is a process to do a directed donation, but for those that are donated according to the deceased donor allocation, they belong to the public. So the criteria for patient selection should be public, it should be transparent, it should be fair, equitable, just, and it should be established with public input. And the transplant community holds this responsibility quite seriously, and they have a broad understanding so that the decision-making that's made on the basis of the committee levels includes not only transplant physicians and surgeons, but it does include, by definition, clergy, potential donors, and also recipients, whether they're transplant professionals or not. And so the rules of allocation that emanate now from the various committees that run through the UNOS system and board and then are approved are actually designed to include input from the transplant community, defined very broadly to include all stakeholders. And of course, we deliberate the benefits and the potential risks associated with these types of decision, but it is a decision-making that organ allocation should fall within the region of public decision-making. And I think that you'll find that the system is highly regulated and highly transparent. And it's the belief of transplant surgeons and physicians and other professionals that, in part, the public's willingness to donate organs is dependent on the perceived fairness of the allocation system. And I think that, boiled down to its essence, that underscores a lot of the principles behind decision-making that takes place. Balancing major considerations, including the task force recommendations to the OPN, included the criteria for prioritization be developed by a broadly representative group that will take into account the need and probability of success. So the selection of patients to receive a transplant should also be made on the basis of a number of variables. And for a long time, the main driving factor was length of time on the waiting list. And one of the issues which you'll hear discussed today are changes in the allocation that has derived from changes in the perception as to what should be driving factors associated with organ allocation. And I think that many discussions that have taken place in the last 10 years have to do with a movement from just an allocation system on the basis of pure waiting time to a system that takes into account medical severity of the recipients, the likelihood of dying while waiting for a transplant, the potential benefit associated with transplantation in certain groups, and so forth. So that the whole system is a very dynamic one. We have fixed legislation now that helps us to provide the framework, but a discussion about changes in allocation are quite germane and are appropriate and do take place with every committee meeting that now occurs. So from the standpoint of patient selection, of course, the transplant centers are charged with making sure that those that are referred and are accepted by the transplant team and that are put on the waiting list are done without prejudice, so that there's equal access on the basis of race, sex, and other social factors. But the recipient selection for a particular organ is controlled by the transplant center. But of course, it's very transparent. And I think the case that we're discussing today is an example of one where there was a variety of opinions as to the legitimacy of receiving an organ according to an alternative allocation scheme. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Childress.
Thanks very much, Ken, and it's great to participate in this program with my colleagues. Let me offer a couple of personal reflections. I actually got involved in biomedical ethics because of this set of topics. In 1970, colleagues in the law school and the medical school, and I was in my second year of teaching here, set up a seminar on artificial and transplanted organs that had two basic questions. The questions that Ken has already raised. How can we increase the supply? What mechanisms do we have available to do that? Which possible mechanisms would be ethically and constitutionally, legally acceptable? And if we continue to face a shortage of organs, artificial or transplanted, how can we distribute the ones that we have obtained in a fair and equitable way? So those two questions persist. While there are efforts, obviously, to increase the supply, and a lot of debates in our society about how we could do that, should we go to presumed consent? Should we go to financial incentives? Should we, in effect, try to break through the system in some way to really increase the supply? You saw from the list that Ken presented that we do face a chronic shortage, and it's not clear that we'll be able to reduce the gap between supply and demand anytime soon. I had the pleasure, as Ken mentioned, to participate as vice chair of the National Organ Transplant Task Force, which made the recommendation that we think about donated organs as a public resource. And I think that was an important shift, and I think Ken has nicely sketched the implications of that shift in perspective, which means that we have transplant professionals and the larger transplant community of potential donors, potential recipients, as well as actual recipients, participating together in order to try to establish policies of allocation that are fair and equitable. Now, there is a moral connection between policies of organ procurement and policies of allocation. Clearly, if we could increase the supply, then we would face fewer problems of allocation. But on the other hand, as Ken has noted, perceived unfairness in a system of allocation will frequently reduce the willingness to donate. And that has come up anytime there's been a controversial case about organ allocation, that some celebrities seem, from the public standpoint, to receive priority. There's been a reluctance on the part of many people to participate as donors. So these two are closely connected, procurement and allocation. Now, the utility and justice have been two very, very important considerations in thinking about organ allocation. And the Ethics Committee, which I had an opportunity to serve on for a while, but not when this report was written, has basically argued that point systems for organ allocation really should take account of a variety of factors that were presented in broad form in the Task Force on Organ Transplantation. Urgency of need for the organ. Probable patient benefit, because urgency of need may sometimes be in tension with probable benefit. Time on the waiting list, which is often recommended more as a tiebreaker, where the other factors are equal, than as a totally independent factor. But then also a variety of other factors that play an important role in successful outcome. The ABO blood groups, the logistics, how long was the organ kept out of the body, what about shipping it, etc. So all those have a bearing on outcome, and the point systems are designed to address those for specific organs, and they are by organ. You can't do this in a general way. And sort of overlooked in the controversy about the children's lung transplant was the change in policy related to kidneys. There have been a process of development for a number of years, focusing mainly on patient benefit, and urgency, of course, is rarely an issue, since dialysis is available as a backup. In the liver transplant area, the controversy in the late 90s, thinking about urgency of need and versus probability of benefit. Because again, the more urgent the need, perhaps the lower chances of success in many cases. And with the variations in time waiting from one part of the country to another. And then, of course, in the lung area, separated from heart-lung allocation, combined for a long time. But as Ken noted, time waiting was a factor within geographical zones, again, for matched blood types. But then in 2005, the development of the lung allocation score. And the lung allocation score for adolescents and for adults focused on medical need and probable benefit. And this involved a post-transplant survival measure as well. So what about children? Well, under 12, there was no lung allocation score that would put these children in the same category as adolescents or adults. If you're under 12 rule, you didn't have access to lungs from adolescents, donors, or adult donors. You had to, those organs went to persons in those groups, and a long, complicated list before you get down to the children under 12. But the factors that were important when children did have access, severity and time on the waiting list, as well as compatible size, though lung downsizing is possible in some cases, and of course attention to the blood type. So that's the context. And then 2 children were identified, starting with Sarah Murnaghan and followed up with Javier Acosta, were identified as in need. Sarah was 10, suffering from cystic fibrosis, and according to the physicians involved in her care at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, she would not live long enough to reach 12 in order to have a greater chance as an adolescent or adult organ. Javier, 11 at the time, and had already lost a sibling who had died at 11 years, 11 months from cystic fibrosis as well. So the parents, Sarah Mahan, were obviously interested in trying to save their daughter if possible, increase the chances that she would be able to obtain a lung transplant. So several arguments were offered. They were ethical, they were medical, and they were legal in nature. They involved cutting across the boundaries. The ethical arguments, and I'm drawing these from the arguments made by the lawyers, by others who are presenting to UNOS, because this played out not only in court, but also in appeals to the Secretary of HHS as well as to UNOS, trying to increase what the family perceived as fair opportunity for their daughter. So one claim was that fairness and equity would really require that she have a different kind of access than she currently had. given the under 12 rule, that this was unfair and discriminatory in effect for her and for others similarly situated. But the argument that this was not seeking preferential treatment, but rather fair, more equal access to the organs that were coming in for adolescents, and in the case, the argument also for adult groups. And the claim was that this under 12 rule was arbitrary. Furthermore, the claim was made that even if in 2004, when the 2005 rules were being developed, included the under 12 rule, that there may have not been enough scientific evidence for a lung allocation score for those under 12 at that time, but that might not hold now. Other arguments for the exception, it would be ethically and legally wrong for the OPTN to continue the existing policy while it studied the issues further to determine the available evidence. And that's from a statement to the executive committee. You notice that these children are likely to die in the interim, and the rule has not been reconsidered in about a decade. And that's not fully accurate. There were some considerations along the way. But then the further argument was that the absence of data was not a sufficient reason to continue the policy. That is, in the absence of counter evidence, the absence of data would not be sufficient. And further arguments, the under 12 rule doesn't adequately address the severity or the needs of the children. They die at a higher rate, their diseases are the same as many adults, and these two had high lung scores, and only a very small number of children fall in this category anyhow, so it really wouldn't jar with the system too much. And so one argument made was, well, there should be a special review option here, as is available, should apply here. And without it, then they appealed to the secretary, and that was made, and they appealed to the courts, which is where this then worked out. So, fundamental to the argument, Sarah and Javier will die soon, and they're being deprived of life without due process of law. So that was part of the argument. And again, I've mentioned Javier's brother's death. And the further part of the legal argument, and Professor Bonnie will address some of the questions related to the legal policy side. The rule had not been published in the federal register and thus didn't have the kind of public comment that was needed to satisfy the notice requirements. So, some key issues, the arguments for exception focused mainly on medical severity and the risk of death, less on the probability of net benefit. It was more on the urgency of the need, and again, I've suggested there's often a tension between urgency and probability of successful outcome. A fundamental issue here has to do with individuals' personal stories, where individuals, in this case children, are at high risk of death. Set those individual stories that appeal to us so much over against developing policies of allocation in a professional, public, deliberative context, where there's an effort to balance several values at work and not simply respond to the dramatic individual case, because the policy has to cut across several. So key issues include here going to a judicial decision-making process versus this multidisciplinary, multi-professional process of deliberation in a public context. And one question will come up is whether, well, that was a sort of a last resort for the family, given the Secretary's unwillingness to respond and UNOS's unwillingness to go to the special review procedure. The judge in this case, after a temporary restraining order, issued a memo to clear up misunderstandings. He was not, he said, giving special preference to Sarah in terms of determining whether or when she would get a lung transplant, but rather only that she should be treated the same as adults. That was the way the judge was interpreting his decision. So age, anytime it's invoked, is often a red flag for consideration of the ethical issues of giving priority on the basis of age. The lawyer was arguing in this case that from a medical surgical perspective, Sarah and Javier are just like 12-year-old children, even though they were only at the time 10 and 11. And the UNOS response, Marshall mentioned in the opening comments, allows transplant programs to submit an exception application for under 12 candidates to be listed as adolescents. And then the second registration modification. At the time, there were 1,659 people on the waiting list for a lung transplant. 30 of those were under 12, had 10 there. The fate of these two young patients, 2 separate transplants for Sarah. The first failed immediately. A rapid and unusual second transplant, both involving double lungs. And the second one seems to be working. I wasn't able to find a report of a transplant for Javier, who turned 12 in August. So, final reflection. We have dramatic cases like this, and they certainly attract our attention and call for our reflection. But overall, the allocation system, in my judgment, isn't broken. It continues to evolve in response to emerging scientific evidence, in response to developing technologies, in response to a recognition of inequities. You can go through changes, for example, in kidney allocation policy and see how the criteria have been modified to address perceived inequities. And all in the context of significant professional and public input. But cases like this may direct our attention and Minnes's attention to, certain specific flaws or deficiencies that need to be corrected. But what I want to emphasize as my final point is the system as a whole works very well with a lot of input from a variety of parties as they we all wrestle carefully with how you balance urgency of need, probability of success, time on the waiting list, and all these factors to have a policy that applies to everyone. Thanks.
I think, let me just stipulate at the beginning that I agree with Jim's overall observation about this. I'm going to dig in a little bit into the legal detail and some of the flaws that may have been revealed here. But I think it's worth saying at the beginning that a trustworthy, stable, predictable organ allocation system that is perceived as fair is of preeminent importance, and that ready recourse to litigation to challenge individual decisions that have been made about particular recipients would be ruinous to the system. The value balancing that has to be done and that has been done with tremendous care, although it is evolving over the years, should be made in the abstract and at a general sort of macro level, and then left to medical application based on the particular criteria. And litigation on behalf of any person, and certainly a dying child, I think, as a day-by-day interference with the system, of course, would be a nightmare. There was an understandably troubled reaction, I think, to, among many people, certainly within the transplantation world, and maybe more broadly than that, to the filing of this complaint and the issuance of the temporary restraining order by the judge. Circling wagons, dire warnings about the impact of rescue litigation of this kind. We should basically leave this to the value judgments that are being made in a systematic way, and then to the doctors to apply it. So one of the key issues here is, does this case set a precedent that might lead us to judicial second guessing of the criteria and their application in individual cases? You see how sensitive the judge was to this in what Jim said. He issued a special clarification after he saw the public response to this and the concerns about it. that it was not showing a special preference for this particular child, but rather indicating that the rule itself that was being applied in precluding her access, as well as for Javier, was an arbitrary rule, and that that should be the rule itself should be suspended, so that these children could be given equal access, and then of course the system would have to move forward. So it was really about a temporary suspension of the demonstrably arbitrary policy while the decision makers took another look at it. The lawyer also that I observed this before, I just think that the lawyers did a tremendously an excellent job, basically, in posing this with, I think, ongoing sensitivity to the concerns of the kind that I just raised. So is this a precedent, or is this a unique situation not likely to be repeated? Let me give you, pending answering that question, kind of a lawyer's picture of what the problem is in here. And I think, as you can see, it's basically a common problem that I think we have to face frankly, in law and medicine generally, in health law generally, and certainly in regulatory, decision making, where you want to try to formulate rules and achieve the benefits of predictability and neutrality, but rules can pinch at the margins. That's the nature of rules, and how much room do you want to allow for individual variation or discretion in order to deviate from the rule, and what would need to be proven in order to justify such deviation. So it's a classic problem that is confronted in all settings. The challenges that have been made, that were made to the application of the under 12 rule here could in fact have been addressed administratively, given how the situation unfolded, and I'll describe this, without the need for judicial intervention. So the issue that I'm describing, could have come up and not had the headlines because the irrelevant agencies saw that the rule pinched, and maybe there was a problem, and maybe some effort should be taken to address it. So the lawyers were trying to get administrative action, and it was only when it became clear that the door was closed on immediate administrative action that they filed the lawsuit. So let me just dive in a little bit here to what the specific issues were. So the under 12 rule that we've seen, you can see fundamentally what the problem was, is, if I can just simplify it, if the potential recipient was under 12, he or she was eligible to have access to lungs that had been taken from children, and within that, subject to relevant criteria, individualized criteria, the kind that Jim mentioned. But if there were no lungs available under those circumstances that would be suitable, then the child would go basically to the bottom of the list with regard to adolescents, lungs obtained from adolescents and adults. So you see fundamentally what the arbitrariness claim is, and that this is basically categorical, based on age. And not on the kind of individualized criteria and factors that are typically taken into account. So it raises a couple of questions in terms of looking, at the rule. So one is there some discretion to deviate that may be allowed not by the rule, the under 12 rule itself, but if you look at elsewhere in the rules that the regulations and any additional guidelines that have been developed within the OPTN system, whether there is some meta rule that would allow deviation, from the rule in a particular case like this. And so one of the factors that made the argument even more compelling is that as the lawyers were looking for whether there was some way to deviate, that there is a rule with regard to the lung allocation score that, I mean, here's the number of it, but it basically says you can deviate with the request of the transplant team, make a request for deviation from the application of the lung allocation, the scoring of the lung allocation system, because there are special extraordinary considerations that apply that haven't been taken into account, sort of an exceptional circumstances rule. And so there was an effort to say, well, maybe that would provide some opportunity here, and basically the system, it was determined that that rule actually did not apply here. So there was no room under that rule in order to be able to make this exception. So the other question is, well, is there someplace else in the system, that would allow some deviation in exceptional cases for kids? Because here you have a situation where, even though the lung allocation score is taking into consideration things that might be pertinent even with regard to the children, there's a way for deviation for adolescents and adults, but what about, for children? Why isn't there some rule for deviation from whatever would be the normal applications of the rule because of exceptional circumstances? And the under 12 rule didn't provide it, and they're unlike with the adolescents and adults. There was no meta rule that allowed deviation. All right, so I think you can see that this is looking like a pretty compelling argument in terms of the absence of an opportunity for deviation from the rule. So then the next question was, does the Department of Health and Human Services have authority to modify the rule since this problem with it had been called to their attention? Do they have the authority to modify the rule? And there was this flurry of correspondence, of course, in the last half of May with Secretary Sebelius. And eventually, even though she showed great sympathy to the claim that had been made, and so concerned, well, maybe we need to take another look at this, she said the process that we'll undertake is kind of the normal, we'll accelerate it, but the normal process of reviewing the rules, and she asked the executive committee of the OPTN to undertake that review. But it wasn't going to change the rule in the interim, or suspend its application, and obviously the concern on the part of Sarah's parents was, it wasn't going to help her. And that's when the lawsuit was filed. So part of the claim at this point, and the judge then intervened. But one of the questions that could be raised is, well, didn't she have the authority actually to deviate from the normal review process in order to suspend the existing rule in order to give accelerated review? Now, interestingly, even though now the litigation had already occurred and the judge had given, the order that made that gave access to these organs to Sarah and Javier. So now this wasn't about Sarah and Javier. This was now about the rule and potentially, of course, other children, that might be in a similar circumstance. And what in fact happened was that it was determined that there was authority to accelerate the consideration of this, suspend the existing rule pending an accelerated review. So if that had been decided in advance in order to take another look at this, we wouldn't have had the litigation and the matter would have been taken care of. So there are two ways in which the applications of these processes was done in a way that didn't allow a sufficient deviation from the rule. So that's what happened, and I think so another question that could be posed here, let me just look at the time, so I think probably I should be wrapping up shortly. Was this exceptional action, as it was eventually taken, justified on the merits? Here I looked at the process part of it, and I think as Jim alluded to, I think the real concern here is that there is surely always a red flag for age-based limitations. Now, obviously, the stakes aren't all that high for saying people can't buy alcohol until they're 21 or can't get a driver's license until they're 16. You just wait. We don't need to make exceptions. But on the other hand, under certain circumstances, given what the nature of the stakes are, we actually do. Even though there's a presumptive rule, we allow deviation from the rule. Under certain circumstances, just think about reproductive liberties that relate to teenagers in terms of access to contraception or abortion. So, they are by nature arbitrary when you draw age lines, but sometimes it's better to have a rule and the stakes aren't high enough to worry about it at the edges. But sometimes it's quite the reverse. And this looks like a situation where it does definitely raise eyebrows that there was no possibility of deviation, from the rule. Another question that was raised in the litigation as well, what was the justification for the rule that was the no under 12 rule that was adopted in 2004-2005? And was it justified then? Were the reasons that were given then for treating, the children differently, justified? And even if they were then, have circumstances changed, and shouldn't this have been, reconsidered? And certainly when it was brought to their attention, maybe there should have been accelerated consideration, given the nature of the challenge that had been made. So I'll just now sort of come back to the original question. So this could be, a case where, as we often say, hard cases make bad law, and maybe there could be undesirable, precedential effects that could be set here. I don't think so. This is a prediction, and I may turn out to be wrong. But this was just a temporary restraining order based on a showing in the complaint that I think you can see, facially, I think has, some plausibility to it. And the judge was concerned about it, issued a temporary restraining order, and then the system did undertake some of the review that was really needed to be undertaken. It was about the rigidity of the rule and not simply an application of criteria, as I said, rescue litigation around what somebody's lung allocation score or priority on the waiting list or whatever it might be is. And the final observation is related to the broad issue of transparency and the kind of public decision-making that's required for the system in order to maintain its fairness. And I think deep down what this is really about is whether this system, which is under the auspices of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and it is, even though private entities have been developed to operate it for good reason, that it is ultimately subject to the oversight of the Secretary of Health and Human Resources. What we had here was a basic problem of administrative decision-making that ought to be subject to some kind of judicial oversight when the rules are challenged as being basically arbitrary. So that, frankly, doesn't bother me very much, as long as it can be done without undermining the system. Thank you.
Thanks to all three of you, and while they're taking their places at the panel desk, we have an open mic now for all of you to offer your questions, comments, observations. Lucky for us, we have a multi-professional audience, and so we can hear from a variety of perspectives. And let me bring a mic to you, and please identify yourself when you ask your question or make your comment.
So, my name is Max Weeder. I'm actually an adult lung transplant pulmonologist. And I would like to make just a few clarifying comments and explain, what the LAS actually is and how it works. So the LAS is a number. It's a number between 0 and 100. And it was designed to essentially stratify who is at risk of dying on the wait list and what is your potential benefit from receiving a transplant. And the reason why people below the age of 12 were excluded from the score is very simple. It is very difficult to place an adult lung into a pediatric patient. It just doesn't fit. And even though you may be able to resect, the lung so it does fit, you're beating the lung up. It's tremendously difficult, and so you can basically assume that the outcome in a pediatric patient receiving lungs from an adult is going to be poor. And I fully acknowledge that the cutoff of 12 years is arbitrary, but that's the reason why that rule exists. And I think the danger of this whole discussion is that we let our emotions drive the decision-making process. And I think it's important to stay objective and ask yourself, why are these rules in place? And I think one comment that I really like is the allocation system is not broken. The second thing is that you have to also realize that in order to get this child to transplants, 2 other patients were bypassed that probably had a better chance of doing well with this transplant than this poor child did. And I think we probably wouldn't be in this position of having this discussion if we had organs growing on trees, but we don't. We have to decide not only who needs a transplant, but who is actually in a position where that patient is going to do well after transplant. This is, I think, what this is all about and should be about. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes. And while I'm coming, let me mention Sarah Murnaghan did finally go home from the hospital in September after 100 days. Total time.
Hello, Kim Schneider, and this is more regarding how they get on the list in the first place. Why might one transplant facility deem somebody not acceptable to their program, but another transplant facility deem them acceptable? Are there published, how do they do that?
Sure. Well, the decision-making about whether a given individual is a candidate for a given organ, the discretion has purposely been left to the decision-making within that transplant center. And so there are designated approved surgical directors and medical directors and criteria that UNOS has established for those positions. And there are committees that are made up of physicians, surgeons, nurses, lay people, other interested parties that will then consider the merits of an individual's candidacy for transplantation. But by design, it's up to the individual transplant center and the appropriate committees. I think that some of the decision-making that takes place can be at sort of different ends of the spectrum depending on the aggressiveness of the individual center. But there is an effort to monitor and try to maximize outcomes with regard to patient and graft survival. So the individual centers are held accountable. And if you deviate more than 2 standard deviations from the overall results of patient or graft survival, there's an audit process that takes place now. And so a lot of this is driven by the need to make sure that organs that are transplanted, it's such a precious resource that we're maximizing the likelihood of the gift. And if you look at it from the perspective of the donor family, the donor family wants to try to help as many people as possible. But it's the organs are sort of within a public trust, and so it's our job as transplant physicians and surgeons to make sure that we're going to get the best outcomes possible. And that's the system as designed.
So for the potential recipient, they just need to shop around until they find a facility that finds them acceptable.
Absolutely. If you are turned down at one individual transplant center, you have a right. And in fact, we are now required by UNOS to make sure that people are aware of that option. And it's also possible for individuals to double list at centers in an effort to try to maximize their ability to obtain a transplant.
And why does that maximize their ability?
We need to move on.
And just as we're going to run through. Matter of fact, if we put the numbers on the waiting list, and this 10,000 more are
Your
listed.
microphone needs to be
Turn
turned
your
on.
microphone on.
Too close to yours.
Yeah.
10,000 more are actually listed because of the double or triple listing.
My name is Peter. I'm a fourth-year medical student here. This is pulling out the initial comment about the arbitrary at the 12-year-old rule and the reason why that was in place by constraints of lung size. I mean, it seems to me that it wouldn't be too difficult to develop a system that, you know, incorporates parameters such as chest volume to kind of solve that solution where it's not an arbitrary rule that has to do with actual measurable biophysical parameters. But I don't know the exact criteria that go into the LAS. So is that something that is in place or something that's being considered? Because it seems like a viable solution to that problem.
It's a great question, and I think that it's somewhat complicated by issues related to organ preservation. And so as part of the LAS system is an algorithm that takes into account distance, because lungs and hearts in particular don't tolerate the cold ischemia, the amount of time that they're out of the body, as well as, say, a kidney would. And so it's not quite so simple as saying, well, great, we have a great donor in you know, the San Francisco area for this girl in Philadelphia. The travel time that would be required would be so great that the likelihood of a good outcome, even if it was size matched, would be low. So there are limitations.
But that's kind of a separate question.
Maybe I missed the question, I'm sorry.
So, sorry, but that's kind of a separate question. What I mean is that, you know, say if it's a 2-liter lung and the 11-and-a-half-year-old has the chest size that's equivalent to one that would fit that lung.
Well, there is a size, that's part of the LAS, there is a size matching.
That is part of the size, okay.
But you're raising, why is this available for the younger person and do it? And I would just respond to
Your
the
mic
first
isn't
comment.
on. Just leave it on, please.
Yeah, leave it on, please.
Okay, I would respond to the first comment. It was not just for the, even though the judge focused on the adults, it was actually the access to adolescent organs that was also important that needed to be addressed.
Somebody else? I will ask the three of you if sort of what your assessment is after all of this legal action and policy deliberation, but also after all of the media coverage of this particular case. What's your sense now? Has there been an impact of this on the public in terms of making organs available, a greater sense of I would like to donate when the situation is appropriate? Or has this harmed the public view of organ donation?
We can put it to vote in this room. I think it's very difficult to.
Having done the survey, I guess my sense is it probably hasn't really had that much impact either way.
I think it hasn't had a dramatic impact so far. I am concerned about the legal precedent that may have been set and now interpreted for other situations where individuals don't have perceived access benefit. Because I think that I agree with the comments that Jim made, and the system is not broken. It's a very good system. It responds to changes in advancement in medical science and organ preservation. But tinkering with it from the standpoint of being able to obtain special priority for an individual through the court system would be tremendously undermining to the overall stability of the system, which has, you know, stood the test of time over the last 20 years. And it isn't really a stagnant system. It's a living, breathing, pseudo creature animal because it changes. It has input from multiple people. And so when it was perceived in the late 1990s that liver allocation wasn't right because people were dying while waiting, the system changed. And the problem with this particular circumstance is that we were, you know, trying to review the system and change it in real time with the threat of somebody dying while they didn't have adequate access. And I do think that short of the actual lawsuits, had it been handled different administratively, either at HHS or perhaps even within UNOS, and I'm not being critical now because it's very difficult to get these administrative decisions made in real time under these pressured circumstances, we could have avoided going to the courts.
This is Dr. Malofsky in Transplant. Just want to make a comment. I think that all these cases have a big impact in the population in the willingness to donate organs, and I don't think that we see that. But if you count that we have a flat donation rate in the last basically years, despite that we are very aggressively pursuing donor after cardiac death, and definitely people are sometimes willing to donate after the loved one die or the heart stop, and all these factors are really being, I think, in part affected by the general for the population when the cases like this happen and the press get involved and the information is miscommunicated and the understanding of people of this is not really the one that we may have as a physician or working in the field, but definitely I think that cases like this eventually have some impact in the population.
It's hard to sort out the factors that make a difference, but certainly one of the major ones is the decline in the number of deaths from automobile accidents. Okay, but Professor Bonnie and I were on a committee for the Institute of Medicine in 2006 and looked into a range of factors and made some proposals. Since 2006, it has been virtually stagnant in terms of deceased organ donation, and it's not clear what we can do, but during that period, the decline in the number of deaths from automobile accidents certainly played a role in the availability of organs.
So on that note, we must end our hour, but please join me in